friends, Jermaine here and welcome to this video. So up till now we've been predominantly focused on the client part of our photo gallery application. So in this video we're gonna be turning to the server side part of it. So we're gonna be setting up our gallery model and we'll be looking at how we can persist information to a PostgreSQL database. So we're gonna be working with Aqueduct, and fortunately Aqueduct comes with an ORM, which stands for an object relational mapper, and that essentially makes it easier for us to talk to PostgreSQL databases without writing actual SQL. So I'm not gonna waste any more time. Let's get into it. Let's quickly set up a build configuration for running our server just to make things easier. So I'll create a launch JSON file, select Dart and Flutter, and the program we wish to run will be our PG server, bin, then our main.dart. Okay, so I should be able to press F5 and then our server should be running. Okay, there we go. So let's test this actually works by curling our server, and there we go. Okay, so we got a response coming back. So we have our server running, and this response is from the lib channel.dart file. So every Aqueduct app essentially needs what's known as an application channel. This is where our application gets initialized essentially, and that includes doing things like setting up our database connection as well as setting up our routes. So in here we are going to set up our database connection. To connect to our database, we need to define two objects. So one is a data model. So I'll do that now. And then what we do is we'll instantiate a managed data model from our current mirror system. So what this will do is Aqueduct will go and find all the models that we've defined, and then it'll capture it under this data model variable. And then let's define a connection to our database. So we want a PostgreSQL persistent store from connection info, and here we'll define a username, Postgres, just make the password, the host will be localhost, the port will be 5432, and then our database name will be photo gallery db, and then I need to make this an integer. So let's save it. And using our data model and our Postgres connection, we need to define what's known as a managed context. So that would combine essentially these two. So at the top over here, I'll get rid of all of that. We'll create our managed context here, because we'll be passing this down here as well, which is why I've defined it there. And then in here, we'll say our context is equal to a new instance of managed context. It takes our data model, and then it takes our Postgres connection. And to connect to our database, we essentially need a database running. So the quickest way of doing that is by using a Docker image. So in here, PG server, I'll create a new file. I'll call it dockercompose.yaml. And then we can come to the Postgres page on Docker Hub, and I'm going to copy all of that. I'll paste that in here, and I will set the Postgres password to password, and I'll also define the time zone for our database. So there we go. And what I'll do is I'll cd into PG server, and then we'll do docker compose app-d. So that should be running our database in the backend, and we've got this UI we can use. So let's go to the browser, and we got that. So let's connect to our PostgreSQL database. We set the username to Postgres. The password was password, and let's log in. Oh, password. Delete that. So in here we can just click on create database, and then we'll give it that name, and that should be fine. And let's try and rerun this file. Seems that we're successful connecting to our database because it's not throwing any exceptions. Okay, so next let's create our data model for our gallery, which will be picked up when this is run. So under lib, I'll create a folder called source models, and in models we'll add a gallery.dart file. I'll import the Aqueduct package, and what we need to do here is to create a model, we need to extend what's known as a managed object, which is essentially how we go about taking advantage of Aqueduct's ORM. So I'll create my gallery model and I'll extend what's known as a managed object, and it extends. And this is a generic type, so we'll pass in a class. So call it gallery underscore gallery, and then we'll implement gallery as such. And next we need to define this gallery class. So this private class essentially maps to our columns in the database. So in here we'll define the columns we have. So we have an ID, and this will be our primary key, so it will auto increment. We have a title, and we have a publish date, which can mark that as a datetime string. And last but not least, we've got a description column. So we need to mark description as optional, and the way we do that, we can use the column annotation, and we mark nullable to true. So I'll save that. Once that's done, that means this data model now knows about our model. So once that runs, it will pick up on this model we've defined here. Okay, so in order to create these columns in our database, because at the moment we don't have it yet, we need to use Aqueduct's migration tool. And the way we can do that is by running, if we cd into PG server, we'll run Aqueduct db generate. Okay, so what this command does is it looks in our project for all instances or all subclasses of managed object, and then it reads all of that, and then it will generate a migration file with instructions to create these columns. So this is the migration file. It's created now, and if we look at that, it's currently empty. Okay, so it looks like the reason why it's not generating is because it can't find this file. So I'll delete this migrations file. So I'll just quickly do an export, and I'll export source models gallery.dart, and let's try this again. Okay, so it picked it up, and let's check our file, and okay, there we go. So we see the generated command to create the columns in our database. And to go ahead and invoke that, we need to run Aqueduct db migrate. Oh, we need to connect to our database. And in order to connect to the database, we need access to the actual port, which I just remembered I did not expose. So in our Docker file, we define our ports. 5432 on this machine will point to 5432 in the Docker container, and then I'll come to our Docker dashboard, and I'm just gonna stop this. In fact, I don't know if I need to delete this, so let's see what happens if I go ahead and then just run Docker compose, and let's check to see that our database still exists. Alright, our database still exists, and then we need to connect to our database using this information. So let's do that again. Do that, we'll pass the connect flag, and then we'll specify our database name, our port, the host, and the username was just Postgres. Okay, let's go. And sorry, that's my mistake. The command we want is not migrate, it's upgrade. Okay, so once we've upgraded our database with our new column information, let's go and check. I reload. Okay, there we go. We've got our gallery table, and then we've got the fields of our gallery. If I select data, there are no rows because it's empty, so that's good. Before we go ahead and add a route for our gallery, let's create a controller in the source for our gallery. Add the controllers and then create a gallery controller .dart, and in here we'll import Aqueduct and we'll import our gallery model. Then afterwards we'll define a gallery controller class that will extend resource controller. Let's define our constructor, and this constructor will take in a managed context. I'll create parameter called this.context, and then let's define that here. So whatever is passed in here will be assigned to context automatically, which means that we can define our get operation. We'll mark this as a future, returning a response, and I'll call this method get galleries. We'll mark this as async, and in here we'll define a query. This is a generic type, so we'll pass in the gallery model to this query object, and then we need to pass our context in here. And then what we'll do is we'll return response.ok, and we'll do an await query.fetch. Then I'll save that. So now let's use this. We'll come back to our channel, and over here at our entry point we've defined a router, and there's one route that exists right now. So let's add another one, and we'll call this gallery, and we want to use the link method, and in here we want to return an instance of our gallery controller, which takes in our managed context that we defined here and assign the value to in here. So I'll close that off, and just make sure that you're importing gallery controller. In fact, I'll adjust it. I'll get rid of this. We don't need that anymore, and then I can make it relative as such. Okay, so let's run our server again. Let's test this. So we can kill to localhost, then gallery. Okay, cool. So we get a response back. At the moment it's empty because there's nothing in our database. So let's go to our database and let's add some data in here. So say new item, and I'll say my first gallery, the publish date, let's set it to today's date, and let's say some description. Let's save that. Okay, and then we'll come back here and we'll try this query again, and there we go. We've got our first entry. Now would be a good time to refactor this file a bit to make it look cleaner, because right now it looks a bit noisy. So I'll delete this stuff, and then I'll delete that and this part, and then rather than entering the string values directly in here, Aqueduct allows us to create a configuration object, loading name configuration from a YAML file. So I'll show you what that looks like. So if I collapse these folders, we have our config.yaml file here, and we are able to define our metadata in here. We'll start with our database, and then we'll start username, our password, our host, our port, our database name, and I'll save this file. Let's create another file. I'll call it config.dart. We'll import Aqueduct, and we also need to import Dart.io, and then we'll create a class called photo gallery configuration, and it needs to extend a base class called configuration. And we define our constructor. This constructor will take in a file name, and then we need to invoke the parent constructor particular the from file named constructor, and that takes in a file object, and we just pass our file name in there. So what that does is when we instantiate this, we'll pass in a path to the file, or we'll pass in the file name itself, which is this one, and that'll get loaded in, and all of that will get processed into this object. And in order to grab that, we've got a helper we can use called database configuration, and then we just name it database. So behind the scenes, Aqueduct will take all of that, and then we'll make that information available as part of this data configuration class. So that will do. And then in channel, I'll import our config file as such. And then I'll define my configuration here, and then I'll load that in this prepare method, and we just want to pass our config.yaml file as such. So that gets loaded in, which means that in here we can do config.database.username, and we can do the password. Then we can load in the host, the port, and the database name. So I'll save that, and we need to adjust the order. So if I reload the server, everything should still work the same, which it does. This would be a good time to go back to our client side app and attempt to load in our first entry. So let me close this and then come back to PG client, and then under lib source, I'll start by creating a folder called services, and then in there I'll have a gallery service. In this file we'll import some libraries, so the .html library, we'll import the Angular package, and we'll import the DL package for making HTTP requests. And also we need to import our gallery model. And then to create a service in AngularDart, we need to start by declaring the injectable annotation. Then we'll define our class called gallery service. Okay, so we'll start by defining a DL client, call it DL, and then we just create a DL object as such. And then we'll define our first method. So it's a feature that will return a list of gallery objects. We'll call the method getGalleries. We'll mark it as async. We'll create a variable called response. We'll make a request to our Aqueduct server. So we'll do deal.get, and we're making a request to our Aqueduct server, which is localhost 8888, and then /gallery. And then for now we can, let's try and log out our response so we can get the actual data we want in response.data. So I'll do that, and then let's run our Angular server. So I'll cd into PG client, and let's run our web dev server. Wait, actually we can't load it yet because we're not using it, sorry. So we need to go to pages, and in our home component we need to import our service. And to use the service we need to define a providers named parameter for our component annotations that takes in a list, and then we inject our gallery service as such, but we need to wrap this in a class provider. The next thing we need to do to use this gallery service is we need to define a constructor for home component, and then we'll inject gallery service in here as such. So what happens with this behind the scenes is that Angular would look at this instance member, it will realize it's a gallery service, and because it's configured here as a provider, it will inject that as the first argument sent when this constructor is invoked. And what we want to do is when we activate routing to our home page, we want to go ahead and make the call to retrieve our galleries. So to do that, we need to implement router's lifecycle methods called onActivate, and then just make sure that you've imported Angular router. I'll override the onActivate method. It gives us a couple of arguments, but we're not going to be using those. And then right now I'll just await, and then on our gallery service I'll invoke get galleries. And let's save this. Okay, our server should still be running, and let's check this out. I'll inspect the console, and you can see here we've got our result from the server, which looks like that. Okay, so this is good. Now let's pass the result to our gallery list template so that we can render actual data that's been pulled in from our database. So I'll go to the gallery list component and get rid of that. Let's add the input annotation so that this will be passed in via props or via the items attribute. And then I'll come back here to home component, and then let's define our items property, and that will take in our galleries. Right now this is not defined yet, so let's do that now. So we'll just declare a list of gallery type called galleries, and let's import the gallery model. We will assign the result of our get galleries get request to this list of galleries. But we're not done yet. We need to go to our service, and then with this response we want to convert the response data into a list of galleries. So I'll create a variable called response galleries, and then I'm going to cast the response data as a list, which will allow me to use the map function. And then for each data item in there, I'm going to return a gallery object, and I'll use the from JSON named constructor, then I'll pass in data. So this will essentially give us a list of type gallery, and we just need to return response galleries to list. So I'll save that, and I'll come back to the browser, and if I reload, now we got that. So let's update our template, and we need to come to our gallery list template, and what we need to do is to output the title from the item. So let's save that and check it again. Okay, there we go, my first gallery. And let's tidy this up. Let's come back to our home component, and then let's add a loading state for these galleries. So add a boolean, it's loading. I'll initially set it to true, and then once the galleries have loaded successfully, we can set it to false. And then we can amend this template a bit. I'll create a div element, use the ngIf directive, which I believe comes as part of core directives. Let's import that, and then we'll say ngIf it's loading our galleries. Then let's just show a loading message, and then if it's not loading, then we'll show our gallery list as such. Okay, let's check this out. So it shows loading briefly. It loads pretty quick, but if you look closely here, you should see loading, and then it loads and then it disappears. Alright, so today's video ends here. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it informative and that you learned something different. If you're not a subscriber, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification icon next to the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any updates. If you've got any questions or you just wish to make any general comments, let me know down below. I do respond to those. And future lessons will also be streamed on my Patreon page. So if you're not a patron and you wish to access these videos sooner rather than later, I encourage you to join me on Patreon, whereby we'll go much more in depth in this Angular and Aqueduct series. Thanks for watching.